Hi, Doug. Welcome to Part Maven, Part Maverick. I'm really excited to speak to you because we did an episode with Patrick McGee about his book, Apple in China. And when I read the book, I'd say the most prominent character that stood out from the book was someone called the China Whisperer at Apple. And you were the China Whisperer in person. So I'm really excited to dig a lot deeper beyond just the Apple China relationship, but to really understand China in greater depth. And to start out, I sort of want to provoke you into sort of crystallizing, what drives you and your work and your books. You've written at least two books on China, and I think you're working on a third. And so, what's your fundamental disagreement with the status quo, with the way people are seeing China, with the way people are seeing global business? Like, why do you do what you do?
Well, thank you, Ridwan, for having me. And it's always an honor to talk to people about my work. And you spend your whole life trying to do something that matters, and then there's a book called Apple in China that's written calling you the China Whisperer. So it's been a journey, and so I'll take you quickly through the journey and then answer your question directly about the real things that drive me. So when I was young, I was a very hardworking kid and wanted to make my mom proud and do something great. She wanted me to be a politician. She wanted me to be president of the United States or secretary of state and so I thought I would go to the University of Chicago and just study economics and then um, work for McKinsey and make some money and then run for office. And that's what. But I had a Taiwanese roommate, and his dad was a famous China scholar named Zhou Yunshu, and my Taiwanese roommate was named Leo Shu. And in our freshman year, we went to high school together and then college together, and so we were roommates in the University of Chicago. And we would sort of play these games where he would try to teach me Chinese tones, and I would imitate him. And I have this funny relationship with Chinese because I didn't know this when I was young, but I had trouble reading, and I was a good student, but I'm dyslexic. And this was the 1970s, so nobody knew how to diagnose these things. But it turns out when people are dyslexic, they often develop what's called an audiographic memory. So you can just repeat anything that people say, which I used to do very well. And it turns out for a tonal language like Chinese, where first of all, characters aren't affected the same way by dyslexia as the way English words are. And if you're somebody who can just listen to language lab tapes and memorize them and come back and speak perfectly, you know. And so when we were figuring out our classes for sophomore year, Leo said, Doug, Chinese is your future. You have to do this. And I was like, and then he did what you do when, you want to make a 19-year-old do something. When I was just going to take German and just do my economics, and he was like, "You're afraid. You're scared." I'm like, "I am not. I'll show you." So the next thing I know, I'm taking Chinese, but I fell in love with the language. I loved talking. I loved doing it. I loved listening to the language lab tapes. But then the thing that happened that changed my life was that spring the Tiananmen movement broke out. And so there I was, an ambitious young kid.
And were you in China then, or
No,
were you in Taiwan, or
I
what?
was I was in Chicago, but this happened in the spring of 1989, and so there we are. Like I'm an ambitious kid who's in love with Chinese and wanting to do something in the political world, and I'm watching kids my age stare down tanks to change their country. I mean, I was just like, and so at that time I was like, I have to go to China, and so I borrowed some money from my grandparents and took a leave of absence. But when the massacre happened on June 4th, I couldn't go to China, so I went to Taiwan. And I spent a year in Taiwan, just immersed in the language, and came back. And I was like, China is my life. And so I became a Chinese language and literature major, and just studied Chinese language, literature, and history. And I minored in economics still because it was important to me. But so when I went to graduate school, I knew that I had to still study the Chinese economy. But so I went to Berkeley and got my PhD in economic sociology with Tom Gold and Neil Flickstein. And during that time, I lived in China, and I did a kind of study that I can tell you more about if it's interesting, but it was something that nobody had ever done before, and it got me a lot of attention. And so,
And what was it?
well, back then, mostly when people were studying the Chinese economy, they were studying State Statistical Bureau data, which, everybody was suspicious of because people were like, this is not real. And if you wanted to be an ethnographer or do in-depth interviews, the government would always organize where the interviews would be done. So, like, of course, if you're, doing a tour of a factory, it's one of the great factories. And so nobody,
That's a very Soviet thing,
right,
right? They was it Potemkin villages or
exactly,
whatever. I don't know if I'm
exactly.
pronouncing it correctly, and you're always shown what you're supposed to see.
But I was just determined to do something different. And in the Shanghai library, I stumbled upon this compendium called 中国七十页名录全书, which means the almanac of all Chinese enterprises. And it was just this book that was a list of the address and phone number and name of every single Chinese enterprise. And so now I had a data set. And my Chinese was good enough that I would call up these factories and say, I would pick them on a random sample and I would call them up and say, I want to come interview you. And they would always be curious, like, your Chinese is pretty good. Are you a foreigner or are you Chinese? And then I would show up looking like this. And so I had this data set that nobody had because I personally gathered the data from every single one of the enterprises in my data set. And that got me a lot of attention. My doctoral thesis won a big award, and then I wrote a book called Dragon in a Three-Piece Suit and got jobs in academia, and that was great. And so I just sort of went on this road of academia and became a dean of a business school at George Washington University at a pretty young age. And then I was very famously fired from that job, which was very painful. And it was very
How did that happen? If you don't mind, like, was it geopolitics or like what was the?
well. The thing most people don't realize is that universities, especially private universities, but universities in general, we think they're places of higher education and learning, but they're corporations. And, when basically if you're a business school, you usually owe about 30% of your revenues to central administration. And so when I came in, I negotiated a deal with the president and the treasurer saying that, okay, we'll do your 30%. I think it's a little high, but anything that I build in custom and non-degree executive education is the schools. That's mine. And they're like, okay, whatever, Professor Guthrie, for sure. But in 3 years, I had built a $50 million business in custom and non-degree exec ed. And so the school was doing great. But then when I got my budget for my leading up to my fourth year, they were basically violating the agreement. And so I had sort of a big fight with the president and the treasurer. And it turns out you probably shouldn't send emails to a lot of people calling your boss an idiot. Um, and so that was, it was bad. It was bad leadership on my part. And I was fired very publicly, but which was painful. But one of the things that was fun about it is that my future boss, Joel Podolny, who worked for Tim Cook, read about it. And he called me and he said, he had been trying to hire me years earlier when he was at Harvard and then when he was at the dean at Yale. And so, he said, why don't you come work for us? And I said, all right, send me to China and I'll come. And so I did that and I worked for them for 5 years from 2014 to 2019. And as Patrick writes, it was hard work and I think we did good things. It broke my heart a little bit. And then eventually I had a bit of a breakdown and realized I had to get my family back to the United States. And so I came back and my then wife, she's now my ex-wife, but the mother of my kids, she got a job in the law school at the University of Michigan. And I got a job at Arizona State University at the Thunderbird School of Global Management. And so I'm the professor of global leadership there and the executive director of China initiatives. And I love the work. So it's been a journey for sure.
Yeah, what a fascinating journey. If I could riff on something that I don't know a lot about, and I guess a lot of listeners don't, which is around Apple University, because I think your official title was something like Director of Apple University. Could you kind of unpack that a bit? Like, why does Apple have a university? Who came up with that idea? What are they teaching? Whom are they teaching? What's the purpose? And where does this all go?
Sure. Sure. And I was a senior director at Apple. My boss, Joel Podolny, was the vice president, and he was the founder of Apple University. And so I don't know if my title was maybe it was senior director, but I think it was maybe head of Apple University in China or something like that, because I was the lead for the China initiatives. But to your question, a few corporations have universities. So I think GE has GE University, and there are a couple. None are, I think, as good as Apple University. But basically, what happened was, Steve Jobs was founder and with Steve Wozniak, and then he was fired from his own company in 1985 and was brought back in 1997. And, as they grew from 97 through the next decade, Apple was big and powerful and global. And, they were very focused on like, how do we train people to really be the most innovative leaders in the world? And, you can do that through sending them to an exec ed operation like George Washington University or Thunderbird, or you could build it internally if you have enough money to do it. And Joel Podolny, I think, is just an amazing mind in the field of organizational leadership and organizational culture. Um, and Steve Jobs went out and found him. At that time, Joel was the dean of the Yale University School of Management. And Steve Jobs said, I want you to come work for me and build this thing. We'll call it Apple University. And so initially, Apple University was just sort of was an internal university that really focused on organizational leadership, organizational development, corporate culture. And I taught that stuff too, but because I'm a China guy, and because their exposure in China was so large by the time I got there. So Joel started Apple University, I think, in 2008, and then, was building it. And so by the time I got there, Apple University was pretty well established, but they had a China presence, but it was only focused on the leadership stuff. But, with Xi Jinping coming to power, so I can't remember if Patrick writes about this in the book, but around the time when I was starting to talk to Joel and Tim, so Xi Jinping comes to power on on March 14th, 2013. And March 15th of every year is something called Corporation Day. And so the government calls out some corporation, could be a Chinese corporation or it could be a foreign corporation, and just says, hey, 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 you need to pay attention. Um, and of course, on March 15th, 2013, that company was Apple. And so that really got my attention because I was like, okay, 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 shot across the bow. The signal has been. So when I started talking to Joel and Tim, that had just happened. And so I was like, you guys got to send me to China and I will do the leadership development and culture stuff. But like, you guys are in bigger trouble than you know. And so, and it turned out if initially, Ruben, they thought, okay, Doug, we get it. You're just worried. It's fine. We're fine. There was just a warranty issue. It's fine. I was like, no, no. And then the next thing that happened in 2014, there was a CSR study and Apple ranked really, really low in it. And then in 2015, the labor laws changed, which I think we're going to talk about in a little bit. And so it was a time when we were realizing like, finally I had their attention, like you guys. So my job was to do the leadership development and organizational culture stuff, but also I became part of what they called the Gang of Eight, which was the group of people that were helping to advise the leadership team on China.
And that's so fascinating. And I think what you say, I mean, what comes across is really that, when you're doing business internationally, it's about reading between the lines because sort of every culture and every country has, you can't just sort of read the letter of what's written and then just follow that blindly. And that brings me to my first question around what you argue in your book, China and Globalization, right? You argue that the reforms in China are way deeper and way more radical than most Westerners admit. And so now looking back, what do you think that the rest of the world hasn't really understood of the scale of change that has happened in China? Like, what's the reading in between the lines part that most people don't see that you think people should sort of delve more on?
Sure. It's a great question. And, my own work really focuses on this. And in addition to the books that you've very kindly mentioned, we also have when I left Apple and came back to the US, we started this virtual think tank called On Global Leadership. And COVID then hit. So I was terrified because I couldn't get back into China. But then I have a team of people who are sort of semi-retired consultants who have been doing, I've known them for 30 years. And so they joined the team. And so we all do this kind of research. And so the key thing that I just would mention that comes through, I think, in all of those books, um, is that for 45 years, 46 years since 1979 and the normalization of U.S. China relations, Deng Xiaoping shaking hands with Jimmy Carter, um, China has been assiduously building the most sophisticated manufacturing supply chain in the world. Okay, so, often if you're just somebody who's belittles China a little bit or is a little bit dismissive, you're like, whatever, it's just, you know, hundreds of millions of people in cheap labor. And so, like, yes, we can do this in India too, or we can do it, throughout Southeast Asia. But that's just such a misunderstanding of what's happened in China over the last 45 years. China,
The naive joke was always when I came to Europe as a graduate student was always, oh, it's children making iPhones kind of thing, like because of all the Foxconn, sort of they make people work and sweat very hard. And so the joke was always, oh, it's just poor people, essentially, kids assembling iPhones. And it's so not that, right? That's why I'm so glad
well,
you're
and
expounding on
not
this.
only is it not kids assembling iPhones, which is just sort of a ridiculous idea or stereotype, because these are very, very, very skilled manufacturers that are working the assembly lines. This is not just like, people being told what to do and these are people who know how to operate the most sophisticated manufacturing supply lines in the world. But it's also the most sophisticated manufacturing supply chains in the world. So like, the idea of like, okay, let's put tariffs on and let's have Apple build its iPhones in Texas. We'll have Foxconn come over. Like, that's not how it works. Like, it takes decades to build those supply chains, and the sophistication of those manufacturing supply chains is it's unsurpassed in the world. But the other thing that's really interesting, Ridwan, is that China has been so smart at not just building a single factory that can do these things, but in building industrial clusters. So a given city will have, everybody knows Foxconn is in Zhengzhou, but so is Pegatron, and so are a number of the other players that are all competitors. And so these companies all push each other and they all learn from each other. And so, or touchscreen glass, right? You have industrial clusters in different cities that are 10 firms all doing touchscreen glass, and they're all competing against each other, which is good for Apple because Apple is in such close alliance with its manufacturing suppliers that those companies, the competition for Apple's attention drives prices down. So here's my favorite statistic in the world about Apple. And the numbers have changed a little bit since I was there, but when I was there and writing the reports that I was writing for them, so Apple controls about 50% of the smartphone market share in the world, right? And so one out of every, not 50%, about 30%. So one out of every three people have an iPhone. You want to guess what percentage of the profits they take in that sector?
80%, right?
Today it's about eight.
That's this kind of crazy Pareto, right? Almost like 25, I think it was 25-80, something like that.
Yes, it's
30,
about
30,
25.
85.
It's about 25.80 now. Back when I was working there, it was about 25.90. And the reason is
Wow.
because these companies are willing to work for Apple for 0, 1%, or 2% margins. Why would they do that? Well, because they learn so much from working with Apple that then they turn around and make all of their money from Huawei, Oppo, Vivo, Samsung, and everybody else. And so, but again, Apple plays a role in this. And, I think maybe Patrick overstates it a little bit because I know plenty of people in China who think we're not awesome just because of Apple. Like, we're awesome because we've been doing this for 45 years. But Apple does play a big role in teaching efficiency in the manufacturing supply chain. So to get to the answer to your question, this isn't just a place of cheap labor and a lot of bodies in factories. This is the place of the most sophisticated manufacturing supply chain in the world, bar none. And if India was going to be the new place where we were going to move all of our production because of tension with Apple, it would take 30 years. If we wanted to rebuild it in the United States and use tariffs to incentivize companies to build these things, it would take 30 years. Like, there's nowhere else in the world that's even close. And so
Yeah, and I think what I've heard about like even manufacturing in the US today, apparently the towns are full of Europeans from different countries because the US really hollowed out its manufacturing base. I mean, never been to the US, but that's sort of what I've heard from executives. And just to kind of riff on, I think the scale of what you're speaking about is in another interview on OGL. You said there are about 350 million migrant laborers from the poorest parts of China, and they work as this kind of on call manufacturing labor. And so for every iPhone launch or whatever, that's the pool of talent. And I was just quickly searching for the population of the US while we spoke, and I think the current estimate is about 340 million. So this is more than the population of the entire US available on call to ramp up and ramp down. And I don't think any country can provide that. I mean, you spoke about India, and I was actually born and brought up in India. But I mean, there is no like the mechanisms required just from a HR perspective to be able to ramp up and ramp down this level of talent just don't exist because it's not as centralized in the same way, which really leads to the next question. And I think you say, you write that China's reforms are not just so actually I think the national industrial policy part is super important, right? So you make the provocative case, right, that China's economic miracle was because of state involvement, right, not in spite of it, right? And this clearly goes against all sort of neoliberal orthodoxy, right, which is, let the state disappear and markets will take care of everything. And the big irony here is that, as you described, suppliers working for free or almost for free, like for 0 or 2% margins for Apple, is too good to be true. And any neoliberal market orthodox should know there's no free lunch, and so obviously they're getting something out of it, even though it's not necessarily directly monetary. So, like, do you want to really unpack China's industrial policy, because I think this is probably one of the most underappreciated sort of um, efficient and massive impact policies in the world.
Yeah, absolutely. And so, I love that you're going in the direction of economics and you're speaking the language. I got my first undergraduate degree in economics at the University of Chicago, and later my economics work was at Berkeley. Um, but neoclassical economic theory it's a bad theory. The idea, so what we talk about, the current administration talks about China stealing our jobs, and China has stolen our jobs for the last 40 years. China didn't steal our jobs. Milton Friedman and Ronald Reagan invited corporations to go abroad and find cheap labor so that there could be higher corporate profits. And the whole theory of trickle down economics was that, okay, and if corporations are making lots of money, it's going to trickle down into the American economy. I'm sorry, actually, it didn't. Like, what happened was it trickled down into China because that's where we were buying labor. And then the corporations that had so much money put that money into executive packages. This is not, and so, like, we're the ones who hollowed out the manufacturing supply chain in America. And, if you look at the average wages 45 years ago, we had a lot of union jobs that were paying $40 an hour. We don't have those jobs anymore, and they've been replaced by jobs that pay $7.25 an hour at Walmart. And so yeah, there's a lot of pain, but China didn't do that. We did it. We did it through neoclassical economic theory. And, there has been since 1939, but, especially since 1980, there's been the largest shift of wealth from the bottom quartile to the top 5% in the history of the country. Like, that is what we've seen. So that's, sort of the first thing here is that, but the interesting thing is that, when we think that government involvement in the economy is a bad thing, we're just not thinking correctly about this. We did much better in America under Keynesian economics than we did under neoclassical economic theory. And there are, a lot of neoliberal economists who hate the idea of the government being involved. But if you want to build manufacturing supply chains, governments have to subsidize growth. So think, for example, the state of Arizona, the city of Phoenix, the fastest growing economy in America. And probably Arizona is going to be the fastest growing economy at the state level. Why? Well, President Biden did the CHIPS Act and gave $6.5 billion to the city of Phoenix to incentivize a little company called TSMC to come build chip factories in Arizona And you know how much TSMC is invested in Arizona? About 160 billion. And so, well, there was an initial 100 billion and there's another 60 billion coming, but it's going to be 160 billion. So think about what that does to the economy. So you have this state market relationship. You have Biden giving 6.5 billion, and there are lots of neoliberals who would say, why is he giving money to the state of Arizona to build manufacturing supply chains? They should. But what it did was it incentivized TSMC to build 3 and maybe 5 fab factories that are going to create so many jobs. And so I'm a big believer in the state market relationship. Now, the thing that's interesting about China is we think communist societies are evil and they're just about authoritarian dictatorships. But China has been so smart at how it's built its economies. My favorite article on China forever, and it's still the same case, it was probably the article that influenced my dissertation and influenced my first book and later books and is influencing the work we're doing right now, was an article by a great China scholar named Andy Walder, who's a scholar. He used to be at Harvard and now he's at Stanford, but he's one of the great China scholar minds of any generation. I mean, but he wrote an article in 1995 in the American Journal of Sociology called "Local Governments as Industrial Firms," and it still rings true to me today. You know, like I'll go out and part of my research is I'll go out and interview people in the directors of the bureaus of commerce in Zhenjiang. And, these are smaller cities that nobody knows about. And these guys, okay, so they're Communist Party officials, but all they talk about is innovating around how to create better economies for their little cities. And, it's funny when you talk to these people, you're like, you really focus a lot on innovation and economic development. Like, Professor Guthrie, that's my job. My job is for this city to grow 6% this year. And so when the Xi Jinping is talking about numbers like 5% growth, it's not just Beijing ordering people to do it, it's Beijing helping small governments think about how to incentivize growth. And so you have this whole process of it's not just like Moscow telling people what to do. This is Beijing with very, very smart people. And by the way, one of my favorite economists in the world, Justin Lin Yifu, who got his PhD in economics at the University of Chicago, but he was a friend of mine because he was the chief economist of the World Bank when I was the dean at George Washington. He's Xi Jinping's economic advisor. And I think the guy's brilliant. And I think, so anyway, I guess the main point or the main answer to your question is this is not just a communist authoritarian system in which Beijing is pointing to places and saying, do this, do this. This is a place where Beijing and Justin Lin and all of the local officials have created a culture of obsession with economic growth. And they know that there's a match because if they need something like we had in the United States, the CHIPS Act, where 6.5 billion was invested in Arizona, they get those kinds of incentives. And so there's a constant feedback loop between what's happening at the state council level and what's happening at the local governments as industrial firms level. And it's brilliant. Like they just have created, in my opinion, the most dynamic capitalist economy in the world right now, and maybe one of the most dynamic capitalist economies in the history of the world.
Yeah, no, there's just so much to unpack there. I think a couple of things that stood out. I mean, when we say, like we need to let the markets do everything, I think the most extreme example for me was reading Safi Bakal's book called Loon Shots and how he describes Vannevar Bush modernizing the U.S. Army starting around 1940. Because, the Nazis had swept through Europe. They were like a crazy war machine. And he very quickly realized there is no way in hell that just the military on its own is going to be able to stand up to this. We need a coordinated uh, industrial policy, like a military industrial policy, all the way, reporting like whenever Bush reporting directly into President Roosevelt. And from what you described, right, was this centralized coordination and goal setting with a clear North Star, and the North Star was always, will this help us win the war? And so there's this interesting anecdote when Norbert Wiener, one of the physicists, part of this Manhattan Project and all the other sort of secret labs working together all across the US, he goes with this idea to build a computer, and Bush does not give him the funding because he says, I don't think it will be ready before the end of this. It won't help us win this war because we're not speaking of the next war, we're speaking of just this war. And so it kind of allows you to it allows you to decentralize resource allocation towards one clear goal. And and that was national industrial military policy. And I think from what you describe, this model works, also in times of peace, right, or when you're not at war. And I think China is doing it brilliantly, by empowering every province, every city to be competitive, and to actually run like a business.
Yeah, yeah. Local governments as industrial firms, and this is how these people talk. And again, I told you the story already, but it's just so funny when you're talking to these directors of commerce and they're Communist Party officials, but they talk like rabid capitalists, and but they're not just rabid capitalists so that they can make money and put it in their
For themselves,
pockets.
but for
It's for
yeah.
like, if I am going to advance in the economy. I mean, Xi Jinping, we think about him as, crazy authoritarian dictator, but the reason he's in the position he is because he was the governor of Zhejiang province, which had Hangzhou in it, and it was very clear, like he knew how to run those economies, and so again, like I think even he's an example of that.
Yeah, or Hu Jintao before him, or all these guys, right? I mean, they come out through a cutthroat competitive system, and which makes me actually jump to a point where I wanted to unpack, which was China as the teacher today in the world. And just before I ask the question, there's a personal anecdote of why I'm so interested, because uh, in around 2019, it would have been the last opportunity for me to apply for the Schwarzman scholarship, right, that the private equity billionaire started. He wanted to make it like a new roads for this
I
century.
know it well. I helped to advise him a little bit when he was setting it up.
Oh wow, okay,
As a
lovely.
teenager.
Yes, I was about to apply in 2019. I would have just turned 27, I think, that year, and so would have been but then I had just been made sort of non-equity partner at a boutique consultancy, and so it was a big responsibility. And I was like, okay, forget about roads, and thank God, because otherwise I would have been in China during the pandemic, or I might not have even made it. So in some ways, it was a narrow escape, but I think that passion and interest has stayed.
Yes.
And I've never been there yet, but I think I try to at least read and understand as much, learn as much as
Well,
possible.
you speak like you're deeply knowledgeable about it, so I'm impressed. But we'll have
Yeah,
to
no,
get you there
so
sometime.
I mean, yeah, and I think you've really been on the ground and for so many decades, and so China as the teacher, I think, is very interesting, because you always get this impression as if there's always a patronizing view towards China or India or other
Right.
countries, where you go like, yeah, they're learning from us, right? But I think there are so many things on which China is just doing it so much better, and you just described this decentralized execution. I feel governments have, and this is something that the book Abundance by Ezra Klein and others also writes about, where we have now created a system where the right wants to destroy government and the left does not know how to run government in the West, and that's problematic, because you need to learn how to get government and business to work together. It's like it's an ecosystem with multiple actors. It's a system. You need to make the entire system work. It's not about one working and the other not working. And so China as a teacher, right? So in China and globalization, you suggested capitalist countries, powers should learn from China's reform model, right? And in 2025, right, when we're speaking now, what, if anything, yeah, does the West need to learn from China? Like, what would be, I don't know, your top three priorities?
Sure. So, so it's a great question, and let me just unpack it uh, in terms of how I've written about this in my career, but how I'm writing about it, especially today, because the the world changes, right? And I'll mention something about this in a minute, but like, what China was doing in the 1990s was amazing, but it couldn't do that anymore with the entry into the WTO. And so one of the things is that China has just remained dynamic in constantly changing what it was doing. So that brings me to the first thing that I love to always talk about with China, um, is being a strategic learner is so important for economic development, right? So countries that stumble in economic development, and the U.S. is doing it right now, are the arrogant countries that think we're the greatest economy in the world. Why? How can we learn from it? Everybody should be learning from us. I'm sorry, China's manufacturing supply chain and the system that they've set up is so much stronger than the United States right now that this idea that tariffs are going to solve the problem is ridiculous. What has to happen is we should be learning together, right? And so just as a one concrete example, um, I used to advise Huawei back when I was in Washington, and this was in the early days of the first exemption or exclusion of Huawei from the market. And then, there have been further exclusions of Huawei from the market and eliminating of their ability to buy chips. Now, I knew the Huawei people really well, and they actually were very good to me. I had an accident at their firm once, and they saved my life. But the idea that it's smart to decouple from companies that are your competitors is ridiculous. What you should do is continue to learn from each other and continue to monitor what people are doing. So I don't know if you remember this, but when Gino Raimondo went to China about 2 years ago, and this was like a time when Huawei had not only been excluded from the U.S. market, but also it was illegal for any company to develop chips that were sold to Huawei. And it was a funny moment, and I loved this because Gino Raimondo was sort of there to lecture China about unfair subsidies and dumping into global markets, which whatever. Okay, they let her in. She gave a talk in Guangzhou, but that was also the weekend that Huawei launched its new phone that was probably just as good as the iPhone. And I was like, okay, the timing of this is not random. Like, this is Huawei saying, like, you know what? We don't need you because we're doing this on our own. And we'd be better off if we were learning from each other. So smart strategic learning is the first thing. The second thing is I love Deng Xiaoping's phrase that he entered into the economy right after he brought the U.S. and China together, which the phrase is 摸石过河, which means feeling for stones to cross the river. Right. And it's subtle, and I think most people don't realize, but this is a very strong critique on strong theories like neoclassical economic theory. Like, basically what Deng Xiaoping was saying is, look, we know in the other riverbank over there is economic wealth and us being the most powerful economy in the world, but we're not sure how we're going to get there because the world is always changing and we're moving slowly through this process. And so we're going to feel for this stone and step here. And so in the 1990s, that stone was attracting foreign investment. And if you wanted access to China's labor pool, you had to transfer technology. That was the stone they were on in the 90s. Now, I was one of the great moments of my young career was I testified in front of Congress to help China get into the WTO because I believed it would be good for human rights and labor and good for the world. But when China got into the WTO, it became illegal to have a quid pro quo for market access. You weren't allowed to say, if you want to be in the Chinese market, you have to transfer this technology. And so that's a new stone. Let's figure that out. And so the 2000s were very, very open market, and Hu Jintao and Wen Jiabao just sort of let things go. And that's when Apple entered China, and Apple benefited tremendously from that openness. And then Xi Jinping came to power, and there was a new tone. But because they were in the WTO, they couldn't just do a quid pro quo for market access, but they could figure out different ways to force companies to give them what they wanted, which they did with Apple, and I watched it up close. And so feeling for stones to cross the river, very important. And then I've already mentioned it, but Andy Walter's notion of local governments as industrial firms. Great policy doesn't happen because an authoritarian government in Beijing is telling everybody what to do. Great policy happens when a government in Washington or Beijing or anywhere has set a certain amount of goals, is willing to work with local governments to subsidize what they're doing if their plan is good. And then, people's careers advance based on whether or not they hit their GDP numbers. And so I think those three things are really what make China a very powerful place to watch right now, and a powerful place to learn from, right? And again, I think being very aggressive about learning, it doesn't mean that you're stupid. It means that you can learn. And so, there's a famous story with Apple where Zhou Chunfei, who is, she's the richest woman in China. She, when Apple came out with this thing called touchscreen glass, it was going to change the world. So you were no longer going to have the BlackBerry keyboard; you would just be able to touch. And it was a great, engineering feat in Cupertino. But the tricky thing is, it doesn't matter if you have a great engineering feat in Cupertino. What matters is, can you produce 1 million of them in a month? And so figuring out how to do that, but Zhou Chunfei was humble enough to say, like, I need help. And so there's a famous story about Jeff Williams, who was the COO of Apple and a manufacturing genius, just like Tim Cook. And, he went to China, and the story is that he just stayed in the factory 24 hours a day for 6 weeks, and Joe Chimface did that too. And they figured out how to build the supply line, and the next thing you know, they have an iPhone launch and this thing called touchscreen glass. And so it's being aggressive about learning, which I think is also really interesting. Um, and these people they do that, and so I just think it's a really remarkable story. And then of course, Andy Walter's local governments as industrial firms maps onto that, and so that's my theory.
Yeah, I think these three make so much sense. I think the first one is just humility. We you see a lot of arrogance, and then you get out innovated, and because you always dismiss the other person. While if you focus on learning, and here I think Huawei's founder is quoted by Patrick, and there's CNN articles about this where he basically tells Beijing, we respect Apple. They are our teacher. We're learning from them. And so we want them in the market. We want them in the ecosystem. We kind of have this kind of mutual respect of they're a competitor, but we're constantly learning from them too. And I think that mindset would just help all Western companies get even more competitive. And you can't just sit back on your laurels. And it's not the colonial times, it's not the post-colonial times. You can't just sort of look down and just expect the world to sort of stay at your feet, right? You'll now have to also, like, it's like you're playing the major league now, and all the other teams are just as good or getting pretty good, and you need to learn from them, and that's good for everyone at the end.
Yeah, and let me give you one more example. I mean, we're talking mostly about the Apple example, but when I was at Apple, we were watching, and I was asked in my opinion a couple of times, but mostly we were just watching. But this was the time when Elon Musk and Tesla wanted to get into China. And so one of the things that's really interesting about the Tesla question is, um, although the WTO entry made it illegal for China to have a quid pro quo for market access, the one sector that it was mandated or China was allowed to have as an exception was automobiles. Why automobiles? Well, there are safety issues, there are pollution issues. It's a big, so like, okay, if there's one sector where China can force companies to have a joint venture if they want to enter China, it'll be automobiles. Okay. But China had learned so much about how much it was learning from the manufacturing supply chain for its suppliers. And so from Apple. So, if Apple's embedding its operations people in different firms and, those firms are working for Apple for almost zero margins, then Huawei gets to benefit from them too, because they can turn around and start doing the same thing for Huawei, Oppo, Vivo, Samsung, blah, blah, blah. And the Chinese government realized that this could happen with electric vehicles also. And so they wanted Tesla in the market. And so Tesla was the first automobile company since 2001 that was allowed to enter China without a joint venture. And so their Gigafactory, it's a deal that was done with the Shanghai government. But this Shanghai government, and I know it's just because I have friends in these places, and this is what they were hoping for, is the same way that there's this spillover effect from working with Apple that affects all of the iPhone, not the iPhone, all of the smartphone companies in China. So too would there be a spillover effect from working with Tesla, because Tesla, no company can mandate that their Chinese suppliers only work with them. And so what happened? BYD benefited tremendously from Tesla being in Shanghai. And so now, BYD, I mean, I'm not an expert in electric vehicles, but BYD is a pretty good company. I mean, they're leading the world you know, in affordable electric vehicles. And so there's, again, those are just interesting stories of the spillover effects of these things. And it's not just Apple, it's Tesla and a number of other companies that are doing this.
Yeah, just to riff on this, I think so. BYD was a battery supplier for like about 15 years, and then they really emerged as a consumer high-end EV product within years of Tesla entering the market. And I think that's why Patrick in his book argues that like the public discourse was that Tesla is the catfish in the tank to to get the suppliers and other Chinese companies to sort of level up, but they ended up training, according to Patrick, the suppliers just like Apple did, and that's so it was really the Apple plan that was played out in the automotive sector. And because I am based in Germany and I'm German, and I have to ask because automotive is like the core of German industry and the pride of German industry. All the German manufacturers went there, right, and in joint ventures, unlike Tesla, because they went in, I think, in the early 2000s for cost reasons. And even today, I think when you speak with the average person, there is this disdain of, "Hi, I must be poor quality, right? It must be shit. It is cheap and whatever, and or can't be as good as German manufacturing." And I think that, to your previous point, right, the humility to say, "Look, these guys are super smart. They would have learned something in 15 years, and they would have learned something that you don't know. And how about you learn from them to stay in the game, right? Because if now they out innovate you, you can point to certain practices that, like you said, like with dumping or or copying or a whole bunch of other things. But hey, you can do that too, right? I mean, there are no hard and fast rules in that sense anyway, right? Just like in football, right? When you do a bit of a sneaky tackle, there's some gray zones, and it's there, it's accepted in sports. So it's of course going to also be accepted in business. But if you don't learn, right, you're just going to lose, and you can't just be condescending about it.
Well, and just to riff on your raising the German example, one of the things that in my this next book that we're writing, we love Andy Walter's idea of local governments, industrial firms, but we also like talking about cities that people don't know. So everybody knows Shanghai and everybody knows Zhengzhou and everybody knows Shenzhen, but most people haven't heard of this city of Shenyang. Shenyang is the capital of Liaoning province in northeast China, and they're very aggressive in economic development in the healthcare industry, but also their biggest investor is a little company called BMW. And BMW has spent when I was just there a month ago, and I was at the BMW site and getting a tour. Um, and the number that they throw out that BMW has invested in Shenyang is 1 trillion yuan. So something like
What's that in dollars, like
it's
roughly?
something like 200 or $250 billion. Okay, like okay, okay, and trust me, like I don't know the BMW people well. I've met a few people a couple of times in interviews, but these people are not stupid. Like they're not doing that because let's just waste money on Shenyang developing. They're doing it because there's a big play here, and so
They're seeing some kind of ROI out of it, right?
of course, and or if they're not seeing the ROI right now, that investment gives them access to the Chinese market, for the next 20 years. And so, uh,
And I mean, yeah, if I can push back here, because BMW is like this. This is the home brand, right? Like, so if I don't know if you're in Mountain View, it's Google, right? Like in Munich, it's BMW because the headquarters right there. I drive a BMW. Like this goes really, this goes very deep, and it's very emotional too. And the fact that they're investing, was that 250 billion, so like a quarter of $1 trillion in a Chinese province. Um, I think the question is, uh, are they just seeing China as a market? Are they just trying to secure a market, or are they seeing it as an ecosystem where they learn and grow to, right, and get better? Because sometimes I get the feeling in the German discourse that they see this sort of the old linear way where, can we get cheap gas from the Russians, right? Can we sell cars into China? And don't see that as a, as a more circular thing where you can constantly learn and get better yourself. So what's your sort of reading on that?
well, I mean, I think again, this is, I mean, I think you and I are agreeing on all these critical points where, um, the world is a global economy. And so I don't think building tariff walls and, using that as incentives to rebuild manufacturing immediately in America, like we're all learning from each other. And so like the fact that BMW is so deeply embedded and has invested so much in Shenyang, again, like these are smart business people. They're not doing that because just for fun. Like they're doing this because A, there's a big market there and they want people to be driving BMWs. And B, they're learning a lot. We're all learning from each other, right? So they're teaching, but they're also learning from. And again, this is the thing that frustrates me. I mean, certainly Tim Cook understands it, and Elon Musk understands it, and the leaders of BMW understand it. But the Chinese manufacturing supply chain, again, to repeat myself, is the most sophisticated manufacturing supply chain in the world, hands down. And so the idea that you could just go get cheap labor in India, I'm sorry, no, that's not how it works. And so to your point, like all of us learning from each other is a healthier economy. And it's not only healthier in terms of economics, it's healthier in terms of politics, right? So if we're worried about what companies like, I said this already, but I'll repeat myself, if we're worried about what companies like Huawei are doing, or TikTok, by the way, and we can talk about TikTok. I wrote one of the amicus Supreme Court briefs for that, and so I know the situation well. But if like the sort of flip response is, oh my God, data is going to the Chinese government, and Huawei and TikTok are giving data that's a, yeah, that actually happens in America too. And so, so I just think we're in a healthier economy, both economically, but also geopolitically, if we all continue to collaborate and learn. In Chinese, my favorite term is 合作伙伴, which means collaboration and cooperation. And if you're doing 合作伙伴, you're in there and you're learning from them, but you're also able to monitor better what people are doing. And so it's, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, there's a historical example that comes to mind. There's a book by I think David Viviers called The Great Defiance. And what he tries to do is basically document the East India Company spreading around the world. And, it was always this sort of vini vidi vici, like we just came over and we sort of built a global empire. And what he documents is actually for like for a century to 2 centuries, they're getting butchered everywhere. Like the first time they show up in India, they get thrashed. Before they even show up in India, they're showing up in a whole bunch of places and they're losing out. And so it's a story of like a decade or 2 decades before they really spread around the world. And it's the constantly learning, adapting, also some brutality. But what you also see on the other side is, when in Mughal India and with the Mughals and the Rajputs and all the other sort of kingdoms, they get one of the East India guys and essentially put him in a golden cage in their court, right? So they give him land, they make sure they can live comfortably and have a good life. But the emperor wants them, in the court so that they can pick their mind on what's happening in England, right? What's happening in Europe. The Tokugawa Ieyasu, the first Japanese shogun, does the same thing. He has one. He's got a British sort of East India Company guy in his court because he wants to know what's happening in London, and so you see around the world that other sort of great powers, empires. This has been a constant theme, I think, where you don't want to close, like, or even if you are far away, you still want to you still want to know what's happening and learn from that. And on the politics, I think this is getting so toxic. Like, I I've never been to the US again, like I've never been to China, but like from what I see, it's getting extremely toxic. It's the same back home here in Germany, where you have areas that have been sort of hollowed out or have lacked investment, because if you have 250 billion invested, in a province in China, there's some kind of lack of investment taking place from companies, but also a lack of vision from government, right? There's because if I think a local government, a city, had a certain vision for what they want to achieve and they communicated that vision, I'm sure you could convince other companies to come and invest and build stuff, etc. Right? So it's not just as if companies are only greedy and want to maximize their profit. There is definitely a bit of that, but there's also the fact that our entire political discourse has become so shallow and stupid and short term and anger oriented and sort of symbolic, right? Which had Musa Al-Gharbi, author of We Were Never Woke, yesterday on the pod, and he was speaking about how we're constantly busy playing with symbols, right? We're changing names. So one party comes to power, you say, oh, we remove all the generals from the civil war, the bad guys, we remove them, and then the next guys come in and say, no, we're good. We call it the Gulf of America and we'll call it this, and so we're constantly playing with labels instead of in the material world, in the physical world, in the industrial world. And so, what are your thoughts, and how can we get a healthier political discourse that actually changes stuff on the ground instead of just fighting culture wars?
Okay. I mean, and this is such an important moment to be discussing this, Rutvan, because I mean, look at what happened yesterday. Okay. Not only did we have the march with, the military parade, which most people don't realize what that parade was about, but that parade was happening because it was the 80th year anniversary of the end of World War II. Now, what is one of the main countries that saved China from Japan in World War II? And I'm not a supporter of dropping nuclear bombs, or we won that war, and China benefited tremendously. My own school, the Thunderbird School of Global Management, was founded on the airstrip in Glendale, Arizona, that trained a lot of the pilots that then went over to China to train Chinese pilots.
The bombers.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And um, so like we should be friends. Like we should have been like, instead of seeing this military parade in which three authoritarian dictators in the world are like marching around, and three nuclear powers, by the way, Kim Jong-un
Which
also.
three are you referring to? And like,
Well, Russia, China, and North Korea. And now, so that was scary, and I wish we would have been there. I was actually invited to give a talk and to be a part of that experience, uh, because they wanted somebody from Thunderbird to be a part of the commemoration of the 80th year anniversary of the end of World War II. But it just was too complicated politically, and we just ended up not doing it. But the key thing is we should have been there, right? We should have been there celebrating with them, rather than having this, having created such a rift between our economies and our geopolitical stances, that now we're kind of headed towards being enemies with China. But the key thing, I think, there was yesterday's events, which were cast a big shadow, but the bigger event, in my opinion, was meetings between Modi and Xi Jinping, and Modi and Putin, right? So what have we done with tariffs now, Rudavan? I mean, if we are worried about China, we should be being the best of friends with India, because essentially what we're doing is we're pushing India into China's arms. And so, and you can go back 2 years there was a pretty big, I mean, the BRICS coalition was founded, I think, in either 2008 or 2010. But it wasn't that big of a deal, right? So Brazil, Russia,
I mean, they had completely divergent interests, right?
yeah.
I used to joke, right? The BRICS doesn't make any sense. But the thing is, if you tariff the entire world, suddenly the BRICS
Well,
interests start getting aligned, right?
right. Suddenly, if you tariff the whole world, including India, by the way, it creates an opportunity for China to be like, guys, screw the US. Like, just let's actually make the BRICS coalition real. And by the way, this wasn't just this started happening 2 years ago. So with the revamping of BRICS and Xi Jinping's idea that we should expand it, and 9 other countries were invited in, and I think 8 ended up joining. China's goal at this moment is to pivot away from the United States and be the leader of the global South. And so the idea that we would be tariffing both China and India, we're essentially just pushing Modi into close alliances with Xi Jinping. It is.
And I think pushing is the right word, right? Because where is the largest Indian diaspora in the US, right? And the wealthiest and most influential. And so the natural sort of and I mean um, like I said, I've never been to the US or China, but like I was born in India, I grew up there, I have family there, and I'm constantly kind of trying to learn and understand. So like, just personally to know what's going on, and you see very clearly there that there is a love for America, that they look up, they were looking up and learning stuff from America, but they don't want to be patronized. I think there's a lot of times that Europeans never understood that, but also the Americans don't understand, is you cannot look down on the Indians and say, do this, because, they've gone through 250 years of brutal colonization. And like, it's just, they would rather die than then allow that kind of tone. And the tone matters. I think it starts at a very small level in terms of, I think it was the president or prime minister of Lesotho or somewhere who was spoken to badly. So a whole bunch of world leaders were treated pretty badly in the White House, and just disrespected. And I think this protocol, I think the Japanese have that too. A lot of cultures have that, where there is a certain way you behave and you cannot just misbehave with people, and it's seen as an affront, as an insult to the entire country, to the entire population, and it's 1.4 billion people.
Right. And
Right, so it's not something you can take lightly, and the mood has changed. Like, you see that in the press, you see that in in family WhatsApp groups, you see it everywhere, where all this time it was, oh, we are with the Americans and we're trying to be a bulwark to China, and we want to make sure the Chinese don't suppress us or whatever, to now it's like, oh, we hate the Americans, screw them, and we're anyway a big trading partner with China.
and just to go on sort of this last point about, like, you know, chat groups among families and such, this is so dangerous for the U.S. economy, Ritaban, because so, I was in China this must have been my previous trip. So I was there in March, and I was giving a talk on people-to-people exchange. And it was a pretty high-level talk in Beijing, so there were a lot of officials there. And I had just before this had one of my students in Thunderbird in my office, and the poor young woman was crying. And I was like, "How can I help you? What's going on?" And she said, "My boyfriend just lost his visa." And so he was one of the ASU students whose visa got revoked. And because he had had a parking ticket. Like, I mean, it was just sort of, really? Really? And so this guy,
Because he had a what?
he had a parking ticket that was unpaid.
No,
Yes.
that's crazy.
Yes. It was insane. Um, but I was like, what are you going to do? And she's like, I guess we're going to move to Canada. Like, we can't be here. I can't have my boyfriend deported to, to China. And so this person in the March talk stood up and said, Professor Guthrie, why do you guys hate us so much? And I said, no, 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 we don't hate you. And we're like, well, we know you don't because you're a China scholar, but like our sense. And then he basically told this story that is, I think, the most fearful. Like, I think people like Elon Musk and others should be terrified of this, because for decades it's been the case that what this guy said was, my whole adult life, my wife and I have raised our kids to get a great degree from Renmin University or Tsinghua University or Beijing University, and then we're going to send them to the United States for graduate school, and hopefully they'll get into Silicon Valley. And so these are all the smartest kids in the world's second largest, most populous nation. And he was like, we're scared. I'm not sending my kids to America. We're sending them to England or Canada. And I want him to feel comfortable as a family, and I get it. Like, it is
They
very
should send them to Germany.
well, maybe, but just think about how stupid this is in terms of brain drain. Like, suddenly we don't have access to all the smartest kids in the world anymore. They used to always want to come to America to get into Stanford or Harvard or wherever, but they're just like, you know what? Stanford, Harvard, whatever. We'll go to the University of Toronto or Cambridge University, or maybe you
I think it was the dumbest thing Hitler did, right? Where all, the smartest talent from Europe, from all of Europe, moved to the US during Nazi times. And then, post that, America was like a magnet for talent. I mean, a lot of young Germans want to go there, young French people. You have this all across Europe. You have this in India. You have this in China, as you described. So from around the world, people want to go there, and that, I think, that perception has changed. And I know this from guests who've been on the podcast and who are professors at business schools in Europe. They're going and recruiting way more actively in India, because they and then probably, I guess, in India and China and Turkey, all over, and saying, you're welcome. We want the smartest people to come. We want you to learn. We want you to build, to contribute, etc.
it's a disaster what's happening in America right now. And
And I think this is not this kind of perception you cannot change overnight, because trust takes decades to build and can be destroyed within a second.
well, and I love that you frame it that way, because I have had these conversations with people and they're like, Doug, it's okay, it'll be over in 2 years, it's fine. I'm like, no, 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 no. These ideas become culturally embedded. And so all of the young people now who are watching, the star students who are no longer going to America, they're like, okay, where are they going? Oh, okay, England, Cambridge, okay, Canada, University of Toronto, okay. And you can't just like suddenly change it back. Like that's not how it works. And so this the
Yeah, I have a very personal story, right, where you know, close family friend who's one of the leading social impact venture capitalists in India, and he's U.S. educated. And I was speaking a couple of years ago, and he was like, "Oh, my son, if he ever goes abroad to study, it's going to be in the U.S. because European universities are crap and all of that, right?" In comparison, and there was this very clear picture of it's binary. And this summer he toured a whole bunch of European capitals and even smaller cities famous for their universities. So he went to tier two cities, the ones that have good universities, to try and get a feel for what programs they offer and what could be a good fit for his kid. And for me that for me that really sort of crystallized this mood. And these are super smart people who themselves US educated, right, who kind of respect, look up to, have friends, etc. in the US, who will go on vacation there, who are now for the next generation already sort of de-risking, right, or like a pivot away. So
yeah, it's,
um
it's a disaster.
hey, I mean, yeah, this is on learning, just something else came to mind, because if you look at old old civilizations or cultures, I mean, you have broadly, Western European slash American slash Canadian, right? You have the Chinese and you have the Indians. And an interesting book that was that I found fascinating was writings from I think from the 17 and 1800s. Just as the East India Company takes hold in what is Chennai today on the southeast coast. That was the first big hub that the first time they really came to power, and the reactions of the locals there. So a lot of people argue that British education was forced onto Indians, and this is the first sort of book edited with writings from that time in magazines, in local journals, etc. So not books, but like what common people would read. And they're actually lobbying for the English to open English schools in India, because they said these guys are clearly stronger than us right now. They're doing something right. They have control and power over us. We need to learn from them. And so within two, so just think of the trauma of having someone physically take control of your land, your resources, kind of ruling over you with a certain level of brutality, and your first reaction is, yeah, how about we start learning from them? They've done something right. We're smart, we're an old civilization. We kind of have done things right, but let's learn from them. And within a generation, you have English schools there. They're learning English. They're going to Cambridge. They're going to Oxford, etc. And then at some point, you have the Indian freedom movement, which is all the elite essentially that studied, right, that has studied at the best English schools, and also in the US and in other countries, in Germany, etc. But they kind of have a better worldview. And so and so I think to this idea of learning from China, I think is so important, because if you want to thrive and grow and continue as a civilization, as a country, as a people, uh, there is enough proof that even when you're kind of even when you've lost the current race or the current game, the way you get up is by learning. The way you get up is not by starting a fight and trying to knock the other person's eyes out.
100%. And that takes us back to your question about like it's one of the great things about the culture in China is there's a humility, enough of a humility. I mean, people are proud of what they've built in the manufacturing supply chains, but anytime they get the chance to talk to somebody like me or Tim Cook or people who are part of the Gang of Eight or whoever, like they'll do it because they want to learn. So
So perhaps as we wrap up, I think um, I wanted to ask you a question around, does China now see itself as a steward of globalization, as sort of a driver almost of like taking over the mantle of being like a coordinator of global flow of goods, flow of knowledge, etc. Do they see themselves in that role? And and then sort of as you see sort of uh, state guidance and government combined with sort of global capitalism, do you see specific industries, right, that non-Chinese companies can have leverage in or can continue to dominate?
so great questions, and the answer to the first question is 100%. Um, and it's not just that China wants to be the number one GDP in the world, which they do. But so I years ago I wrote an article. It was sort of when I was my little think tank was pretty new, so it was five years ago maybe. And I wrote an article called Xi Jinping is Emperor Yongle. And most people don't know who Emperor Yongle was, but Emperor Yongle was the third Ming emperor of the Ming dynasty. And so he died in, I think, 1324. And he didn't have an heir and, sort of created a crisis. And then the Confucian scholarly elite came in and they, sort of changed China's. But when Emperor Yongle died, China was the largest economy in the world by far. I mean, there was no there was no comparison. Uh, it had also been the economy that was so innovative that they created things like the nautical compass. Um, you know, they created a little thing called gunpowder. They created all of the great innovations came out of China for hundreds of years before that, and so they were very proud of we're the most innovative economy in the world. And when this little guy named Christopher Columbus set sail across the Atlantic Ocean, he had three ships that were 30 people per ship, three mast technology. Okay, and they made it, and they conquered America. But around that time, or maybe 40 years earlier, or 80 years earlier,
The junks, right?
yeah, I mean, Admiral Zheng He used to set sail with fleets of 100 ships with nine-mast ship technology and nautical compasses, and they ruled the world. And so, you know, I don't like the word ruled because I don't think that's the way Xi Jinping talks, but
Influenced.
right. But the idea that China just wants to be the biggest economy in the world because they have a deep, cheap labor force, that's not the story. The story is they want to return to the time where China is the largest economy in the world, but also the most influential and innovative and respected economy in the world, which is, again, part of the reason I've always thought it was so important since 1979 that we were partners with China and we were going to do this together and we're all going to be in this together. But then when we've come in since 2016 and then again in 2024 with the idea of tariffs and divisiveness, and then we've sort of pushed Xi Jinping to invoke and kind of develop the BRICS economy. China's, it's very clear in China, and I talked to officials about this. They're like, we're pivoting away from our collaboration with the U.S. We're going to be the leaders of the global South, right? And so it's going to be okay. And so it's not just BRICS, but also the Belt and Road Initiative is key here. And so think about this. So what are the places in the world that have the greatest access to rare earths? Probably sub-Saharan Africa, maybe the Ukraine. There are a couple of other places in Russia. What is the number one country in the world in the technology for refining rare earths? That would be China, right? And China refines about 90% of the rare earths in the world, right? There's a fun story that it's not fun, but when I was still learning about this and I was trying to figure out like how important is this stuff? The uh, the when there was a dust up between China and Japan in the East China Sea in 2013, suddenly a little company called Sony no longer had access to neodymium. And I was saying to an Apple engineer, like, I don't even know what that means. What is neodymium? And they're like, Doug, do you know these things called earphones? Like, you can't make them without neodymium. And so, like, if China suddenly says Sony's not getting access to neodymium anymore, and you know what? Like, Japan backed down because they had. And so I just think we underestimate what China's position and power is, but we also underestimate what they want. Like, they want to be respected. This isn't just that they want to be the source of cheap labor. They want to be respected and treated at the table. And so here's my other favorite statistic on this, or favorite fact on this. So there's the group of countries called the G7, right? And these are all the most powerful and influential countries in the world. But guess who's not at the table? A little country called China, which has the second largest economy in the world and has a huge amount of influence on the global South. But they can be at the G14. That's okay, and we can go visit them. President Biden will fly to India and visit them and say, "Good job, President." Like they're at the kids' table, and or it's not the G14, it's the G20, and they're like, no, 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 no more. And so I think that we need to watch very carefully. And if I was, and by the way, sorry to call out names, but like the idea that we would have somebody who wrote a book called Death by China as one of the main economic advisors of what's going on with China, it's just like, it's not smart. Like people in China talk about that. They're like, Doug, how can it be that Peter Navarro is advising your president? I'm like, I don't know. But I wish we were a little bit more thoughtful, because I think we're at a critical point in geopolitics, and I think China's ambitions are huge, and I think they're on a path.
Yeah, and I
Like,
think it's a bit like sorry.
well, you also asked a question about what industries, and so
Yes.
yeah, and so
Or if I may
yeah,
quickly, I think it was like when Japan closed on itself, right? And what that led to, and then how you had the American admiral going and forcing them to open. And I think this kind of closing in on yourself is actually it leads to decline more than anything, and the Americans should know that, right? And
sure.
and yeah, and I think what unites the BRICS, I think, because if you look at it from an interest perspective, they're completely differing interests. But what unites them is, I think, a need and a want for respect on the global stage. And this is something I underappreciated growing up in India, because for me, it's like, who cares, right? Like how someone sees you. You should have your own picture of who you are and what you stand for. That's my personal view. But I know that most Indians don't see it that way, right? Most Indians want that external validation, that respect, etc., and want to be treated that way. And the same, I think, for the Russians. That's how they have Putin, right? Because you're always surprised with how he came to power and how he's been there and all of that. And I think because they felt like this is the first guy, who's willing to punch and kick and sort of, make sure we get respected. And when we're not, he's willing to pick up a gun and, and shoot. And I think the same with the Chinese. And this is what brings all these countries together, or South Africa, or.
Yeah, yeah, and I think it's a real it's we're treading in, I don't like to use the word dangerous lightly, because I don't want to be fomenting the idea of war, but war is happening in the world right now. But like, if we're in a trade war and we basically alienate China and push Modi and Xi and Putin into each other's arms, we're going to lose. We lose the trade war, right? And so, like, again, one of the things that people often ask me, like, well, what could happen? I mean, you and I think talked about it briefly, but you know, China can do things that make it impossible for Apple to operate. So, like the 2015 dispatch labor law made it impossible for Apple to operate the way we were, and I won't go into details right now because I know we're tight on time. But I remember these conversations I was having with Cupertino lawyers, and they're like, "There's no way our suppliers can comply with this law." And I was like, "Well, that's the point. You're supposed to be out of compliance." And they would be like, "What? Why? What?" I was like, "Because if you offer to build a data center to the mayor of or the governor of Guizhou province, who was Chen Ming'er at the time, and we thought he was going to be the next leader of China, or an R&D center in Shenzhen, if you offer it, it's not a violation of the quid pro quo for market access. And if you do that, it's very likely that the government's going to turn a blind eye to your violation of the new labor dispatch law." So, like, there are strategic ways to do this, but my sense is that the Chinese government thinks in such sophisticated ways about this that they're winning. They're winning. And
Yeah, well, instead of being strategic and sort of using using bending whatever the rules to win, I think we're like the kid, like the small kid kind of crying and like a sickly kid kind of holding the rule book and waving the rule book and saying, "Oh, no, 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 you're breaking the rule." Blah, blah, blah. You wrote the rules, right? Like the WTO is very much an American and a Western creation, so you wrote the rules. Someone's bending them. You learn to bend them to your way, as long as you don't do, as long as you're not going completely crazy, right? And I think that mindset, that attitude is so much more useful. But to wrap up, and I started provocatively, I want to end it provocatively, because from what I understand, right, in your book, China and Globalization, you say something like, over the long term, democracy is sort of inevitable. Like, what does that mean? And what? So there was this thing, right? Like, the more we work with China, the more China is going to become like us. I think it's obvious to everyone that's not going to happen, and that's not how it works. Neither is it going to be that with India or with any other country. People don't become only more like you, but like are like what is going to change culturally. And what I found super interesting was listening from a mentor of mine, one of the top mathematicians in the world, and he was lecturing again in China, and he said students were asking him things like, what's the purpose of life after a math lecture? So he said, this is new. He's like, I've been going there and giving lectures on math for 20, 25 years. uh, People asking questions that are so foundational around that, around meaning, around life, around issues like this is new. So this clearly, something is changing. So like, how do you see the political sort of future evolve in China?
Well, it's a great question, Rita, and this is part of why, Patrick McGee wrote about this. I didn't know he was going to write about my mental health and mental state, but it's part of why I had a breakdown in China, because I've built my whole career. Like when I fought for China to get into the WTO, it was because, this isn't just about China becoming part of the global trading system, but if we care about democracy and human rights, this is going to be good for everybody. So let's just continue to open up and and I and a couple of other China scholars that I hang with, we didn't see. First, we thought it was going to be Bo Xilai, who was more aggressive than Hu Jintao and Wen Jiabao, but then he was surpassed by Xi Jinping. And I just didn't see this coming. I didn't see the annexation of Hong Kong. The annexation of Hong Kong was tearing up of a 50-year agreement. It wasn't supposed to happen until 2045. And, I think it was a test for the world. Like, what are you guys going to do now? And we didn't do anything. And then, there was the situation of Xinjiang and human rights issues there. And so I'm less confident now, Rita, than I used to be. You know, I'm not, I believe that economies and geopolitical economies are complicated. But generally, I think if you give people more freedom and you give them economic incentives to make money, and then you kind of continue to emphasize things like labor and human rights, it's going to be okay. Like everybody's going to kind of continue to learn more. They're going to be more open to the world, and I'm less optimistic about that than I was, when China and Globalization was written. And so my new forthcoming book is a lot more pessimistic. I just do think that China continues to be a really important player in the global political economy, and I think Xi Jinping was very proud, I think, as I understand it from the people I know, of brokering the deal the peace deal between Saudi Arabia and Iran. I mean, the idea that he can do that, and but he wants a seat at the table, and he wants to be treated not as part of the kids' table, but as part of one of the major global political leaders. But I'm less optimistic about the inevitability of democracy, and I'm sad about that, but it's true.
Yeah, and I guess to wrap it up, I think like I think it's inevitable that people would want more freedoms over time. They need not. They don't. I don't think they need to necessarily copy paste and ape us, because I think we have a lot to learn in terms of how to create dynamic local government, right, within our structures, within our systems, without necessarily having to tear everything down. I think there's a lot of dynamism that we're lacking politically, and a lot of seriousness in the discourse that we're lacking that we can learn from them. And I think similarly over time, when math students start asking themselves the question, "What's the meaning of life?" I think that will lead to something.
I love that
I mean, as a
That's a great story.
sorry.
I love that story. I think that's a great story.
Yeah, I just heard it like, a month ago. I was in India visiting family and for a wedding, and I met my mentor, and he shared this. And for me, it was like, wow, this is something is happening, I think. And then there's, and I think it's very difficult to sort of paint a simple picture. And I'm with you on that. But I think as long as both sides, like as long as everyone keeps learning from everyone else, I think we're headed towards a better world.
So I hope so.
On that note, Doug, it was really a blast. I totally enjoyed speaking with you. Thank you so much for taking the time.
Thank you for spending the time with me. This has been an amazing conversation, and I think you're an amazing interviewer, and you clearly do all your homework. And so I'm honored that you've read and watched some of the things that I do, and that we were able to have a great conversation about it. So thanks for having me.
Yeah, I really enjoyed it and hope to have you back before your next book comes out. That would be fantastic.
I'm ready.